My name is Clara Monroe. For years, my husband laughed at my dreams, calling them childish fantasies. He said I'd never make it in the business world. But when he walked out, I turned his mockery into my motivation. I built an empire from the ground up, the kind of success he never believed I could have. Now his company is drowning in debt, and the only person who can save him is me. But forgiveness was never part of my business plan. Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories like this. When I married Ethan, I thought I was marrying a partner, someone who would stand by me, believe in me, and build a life with me. Instead, I found myself living in the shadow of a man who couldn't stand the idea of me wanting more than what he allowed. Ethan was charming to the world, successful, witty, confident. But behind closed doors, his charm turned into sharp words and mocking smiles. It started small. The first time I mentioned wanting to start my own fashion line, he chuckled and said, "Clara, you're good at picking outfits, not running a company." I laughed it off, thinking he was teasing. But over time, those words became daggers. Sharper, deeper, more deliberate. Every time I shared a dream, he'd crush it before it had the chance to take form. He was the kind of man who believed in roles, his version of them. A wife should support her husband, he'd say, as if my own ambitions were a threat to his success. And at the time, I let him make me believe that. I put my dreams on hold. I stayed late cooking, ironing his shirts, attending dinners where I smiled politely as he introduced me as Ethan's wife, never as Clara. For a while, I told myself it was love, that real love meant sacrifice. But deep down, something inside me was suffocating. Every time I looked at my sketchbook, filled with designs I'd never bring to life, I felt my own voice fading away. One night, as he sat bragging about his promotion at a dinner party, one of his colleagues turned to me and said, "You must be proud of him. What do you do, Clara?" I smiled faintly, the same rehearsed smile I'd used for years. "Oh, I'm just at home these days." Ethan laughed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She thinks she wants to start a fashion line someday. Isn't that adorable?" The laughter around the table echoed in my ears long after the dinner was over. I didn't cry that night. I just lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, realizing I had become invisible, even to myself. A few months later, things got worse. Ethan's arrogance grew with his career, and his words became crueler. Whenever I suggested returning to design school, he'd scoff. "You're not a kid anymore, Clara. Who's going to take care of the house? You should be grateful you don't have to work." But gratitude doesn't fill the emptiness of unrealized potential. Then came the breaking point. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon. I'd spent weeks secretly working on a small business proposal. Something modest, a handmade clothing line inspired by sustainable fabrics. I poured my heart into it, even saved some money from freelance styling gigs I did behind Ethan's back. When I finally mustered the courage to show him, I printed everything neatly in a folder and handed it to him as he sat in the living room, scrolling on his phone. "Ethan," I said quietly, "I've been working on something. I really think this could go somewhere." He barely looked up. "What is it now?" I placed the folder in front of him, my hands trembling slightly. "It's a business plan, something small to start with. I've already spoken to a local boutique about displaying a few of my designs." He flipped through a few pages, sighed, and tossed it onto the coffee table. "Clara, this is cute. But you don't know anything about running a business. Stick to what you're good at." I swallowed hard. "You mean cooking and cleaning?" He smirked. "Exactly. You're great at that. Not everyone's meant to be an entrepreneur." Something inside me cracked. For years, I'd accepted his condescension, but that night I looked at him differently. Not as my husband, but as the wall standing between me and everything I wanted to be. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply stood up, went to our bedroom, and pulled my sketchbook out from under the bed. I turned the first page and saw a note I had written to myself years ago. "You can do this, Clara. Don't let anyone make you small." That night, I decided I wouldn't. Over the next few weeks, I started changing quietly. I woke up earlier, read business books while he slept, and took online courses in marketing and finance. I began designing again late at night, the hum of the sewing machine, my new heartbeat. I sold a few pieces online under a fake name. The money wasn't much, but it wasn't about the money. It was about proving to myself that I could. Ethan barely noticed. He was too absorbed in his company, too busy climbing ladders to realize that the woman he thought would always stand behind him was already learning how to run ahead. Then one evening, I came home to find him sitting on the couch with a glass of whiskey and a smug grin. "Guess what, Clara? I made partner. We'll be moving into a bigger house soon." I congratulated him, of course. But deep down, I realized something chilling. I wasn't proud. I was indifferent. His victories didn't matter to me anymore. My focus was on something far greater: my independence. Within a year, my small brand, which I had called Luna Rise, started gaining traction. Influencers began wearing my pieces, and one of my designs was featured in a digital fashion magazine. I'll never forget the night Ethan came across it. He was reading an article on his laptop when he frowned and said, "Hey, you know this Luna Rise brand? Their designs look a lot like yours." I smiled. "Do they?" He shrugged. "Yeah, they're good. Probably run by someone with real experience." I bit my tongue to keep from laughing. The irony was delicious. By the time he found out the truth and that I was Luna Rise, it was too late. My company had already secured investors, and orders were pouring in faster than I could handle. When I told him, he didn't congratulate me. He accused me of hiding things, of being deceitful. "Deceitful?" I repeated. "You called me useless. You laughed at me for dreaming. I built this because you told me I couldn't." That was the first real fight we'd ever had. Not the petty kind about chores or dinners, but a raw, explosive confrontation about power and pride. Ethan slammed his hand on the table. "You wouldn't be anywhere without me." I looked him dead in the eyes. "Exactly, without you." For the first time, I saw fear behind his arrogance, fear that I was no longer the submissive wife he controlled. 2 weeks later, he packed his bags and left. No apology, no goodbye. Just silence. But that silence didn't break me. It freed me. And from that day forward, I made a promise. Not to prove him wrong, but to prove myself right. The months that followed were a blur of work, ambition, and an unshakable determination to succeed. For the first time in my life, I wasn't living in anyone's shadow. Not Ethan's, not anyone's. I threw myself into Luna Rise with every ounce of energy I had. I learned to negotiate contracts, manage suppliers, and pitch to investors, all things I once believed I wasn't capable of. I didn't have a mentor, and I didn't have anyone holding my hand. But what I did have was hunger, the kind that comes from years of being told you can't, and that hunger was my fuel. Within a year, Luna Rise went from a small online store to a recognized name in sustainable fashion. Celebrities began endorsing my designs. My social media followers grew by the thousands each week, and my brand's tagline, "Reinvent yourself," became a mantra for women who saw themselves in my story. But behind every triumph, there were challenges. Investors doubted me at first because I didn't come from a traditional business background. Suppliers underestimated me because I was a woman. But that only made me sharper. Every deal, every obstacle, every sleepless night built me into something Ethan would have never recognized. A woman who no longer needed validation from anyone. Meanwhile, Ethan's life was going in the opposite direction. His company, the one he used to brag about endlessly, had begun facing serious financial trouble. I didn't know the details then, but I heard whispers through industry connections. Poor management, risky investments, ego-driven decisions, all of it was catching up to him. I remember scrolling through my phone one night when a headline caught my eye. Wexford Pierce faces major layoffs amid financial turmoil. Ethan worked for Wexford Pierce. My heart skipped, but not from pity and from realization. The man who once told me I wasn't built for business was now failing in the same world he claimed to own. Still, I didn't reach out. I had no reason to. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a Women in Business Summit in New York. It was surreal. Standing on that stage, telling my story to hundreds of aspiring entrepreneurs, hearing applause where I once heard laughter. When the event ended, a line of women waited to shake my hand, some even teary-eyed, saying, "You gave me hope." That night, as I stood in my hotel suite overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline, I realized how far I had come. The girl who used to whisper her dreams had become the woman whose name was printed on billboards. But fate has a cruel sense of timing. 2 weeks later, I got a call from a mutual friend, someone who had known both Ethan and me since our early marriage days. "Clara," she said gently, I think you should know. Ethan's company is filing for bankruptcy. For a moment, I was silent. I wasn't sure what I felt. Satisfaction, pity, closure, maybe a mix of all three. He's not doing well, she continued. Apparently, his new business venture collapsed. Investors pulled out. He's desperate for funding. I thanked her for the information and hung up. I should have felt nothing. After all, he'd made his choices. But that night, as I sat in my office surrounded by the empire I'd built, I couldn't shake the irony. The man who mocked my ambitions was now drowning while I stood at the helm of success. A week later, Ethan called. When I saw his name flash across my phone screen, I froze. I hadn't spoken to him in over 2 years. Against my better judgment, I answered. Clara, his voice was low, strained. It's been a while. Yes, it has, I said calmly. I heard about your company. You've really made it big. Thank you, I replied. Silence lingered between us. Then came the real reason for his call. I won't waste your time. My company's in trouble. We really need investors. I thought maybe, since you've done so well, you could consider... I almost laughed. You want my help? It's business, Clara. You've always had potential. Maybe we could work something out. The audacity made my blood boil. This was the same man who told me to stick to housework. Now he was calling me for salvation. I think you're forgetting something, I said, my tone steady. You didn't believe I could ever run a business. He sighed. Clara, I made mistakes, all right? But you don't have to rub it in. I'm asking you to consider this professionally. I leaned back in my chair, letting the moment sink in. The tables had turned completely. I wasn't the fragile wife anymore. I was the CEO he couldn't compete with, the one holding his fate in her hands. Still, a part of me wanted to see just how desperate he'd become. So I told him, send me your proposal. I'll review it. The next morning, his email arrived. His company was indeed collapsing. The numbers were a disaster. Debts, unpaid loans, and a broken structure. Saving it would take millions, and a miracle. I stared at the report for hours. Logic told me to walk away. Emotion told me to savor his downfall. But somewhere in between, something else whispered. You don't have to destroy him to win. Yet I wasn't ready to forgive him either. So I scheduled a meeting. When he walked into my headquarters 2 days later, he looked smaller, not physically, but in spirit. The confident man who once filled rooms with arrogance now seemed hollow, humbled. He paused at the entrance of my office. Glass walls, panoramic view of the skyline, my name etched on the door. Nice place, he murmured. It is, I replied, standing. Let's get to business. He handed me the files and started explaining his plan, his voice shaky. As he spoke, I watched him closely, the man who used to lecture me on how the world works. Now he was begging for a lifeline. When he finished, I folded my hands. You're asking for a lot, Ethan. Why should I invest in a company run by someone who once said I wasn't capable of success? His face fell. Because I've learned my lesson. I tilted my head. Have you? He hesitated, then nodded. I know I was wrong. About you. About everything. I shouldn't have treated you that way. I was insecure. For the first time, his voice cracked with something close to sincerity, but I didn't respond right away. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the city where I'd rebuilt my life. Ethan, I said finally, turning to face him, you wanted a wife who'd stay small. You got what you wanted then. But I outgrew that version of myself. You're standing in the office of the woman you said could never exist. He looked down, his eyes full of shame. So, is that a no? I paused, letting him hang on the edge of uncertainty. Then I said softly, it's not a no. But if I decide to invest, I'll be the one in charge. You'll work for me. His eyes widened. You're joking, I smiled. Do I look like I'm joking? He didn't answer. But in that silence, I knew. The power dynamic had shifted forever. Ethan sat there, speechless. The man who once mocked my ambition was now weighing the reality of working under me. I could see the conflict in his eyes, pride fighting against desperation. I let him sit in that silence for a while before continuing. I'll give you 72 hours, I said finally. Think it over. If you're willing to accept my terms, we'll talk again. If not, I gestured toward the door. Then this conversation never happened. He nodded stiffly, his jaw tight. You've changed, Clara. I smiled faintly. No, Ethan. I just became who I was always meant to be. When he left my office, I felt an odd mix of satisfaction and sorrow. I had dreamed of this moment once, of proving him wrong, of watching him realize what he'd lost. But now that it was here, the victory felt different. Not bitter, not sweet, just necessary. The next 3 days passed quietly. I buried myself in meetings and design reviews, pretending not to think about him. But late at night, his voice echoed in my mind. The laughter, the words that once tore through my confidence. You're not built for business. And now, I was the one writing checks with my name printed in bold at the top. On the third evening, as I was about to leave the office, my assistant knocked. Ms. Monroe, there's someone here to see you. I didn't need to ask who. Ethan walked in, holding a folder. His eyes were tired, but his tone was steady. I've thought it through. I accept your conditions. Are you sure? I asked, crossing my arms. It means I take full control. You'll report to me. Every decision goes through me. He nodded slowly. I know. That moment hung between us like a storm cloud, the weight of irony, history, and the sharp turn of fate. I walked over to my desk, picked up the contract I'd drafted earlier, and slid it toward him. Sign it. He hesitated, glanced at me once, then scribbled his name at the bottom. When it was done, I leaned back in my chair and said quietly, Welcome to Luna Rise, Ethan. Your first task starts tomorrow. The next morning, the once proud executive began his first day as an employee under my leadership. I assigned him to oversee a struggling department, a symbolic mirror of his own company's downfall. Watching him step into my office with the ID badge that bore my company's name was surreal. Word spread fast among employees, and whispers followed him everywhere. Some pitied him. Others found poetic justice in the story, the ex-husband who'd once belittled his wife now reporting to her. For the first few weeks, he kept his head down. He worked hard, maybe harder than I'd ever seen before. He attended meetings quietly, avoided confrontation, and focused on his projects. But every now and then, I'd catch him looking at me with a strange expression, part regret, part admiration. One afternoon, after a long meeting, he approached me. Clara, he said softly, I just wanted to say, thank you. For what? For giving me this chance. You didn't have to. I studied his face, older now, humbled. You're right. I didn't have to, but I didn't do it for you. He nodded, understanding. You did it for yourself. Yes, I replied. For the woman you tried to silence. He didn't argue. He simply smiled faintly and walked away. Weeks turned into months. Under my direction, his department began to recover. Sales improved, efficiency increased, and he actually started earning the respect of the team. One evening, as I was reviewing quarterly reports, my assistant came in and said, Ethan's department exceeded projections by 20%. For a second, I felt a flicker of pride. Not for him, but for the strange symmetry of it all. Life had a way of balancing its own scales. That night, after everyone had left, I walked through the empty office. The city lights shimmered through the glass walls, casting golden reflections across the floor. I stopped by the window, the same one I'd looked through when Ethan came to beg for help, and thought about everything that had led me here. The tears, the laughter, the humiliation, the struggle, all of it had built the woman standing there now. I wasn't just a CEO. I was proof that the things meant to break you can become the very reason you rise. A few weeks later, Ethan requested a private meeting. I agreed. He came in looking calmer than I'd ever seen him. Clara, he began, I'm leaving the company. I raised an eyebrow. You're quitting? He nodded. It's time. Working here has been humbling. I learned more about leadership and respect in these months than in all my years running a company. But I can't keep living in the shadow of my past mistakes. I listened quietly as he continued. I just wanted to say I'm sorry, not as your employee, Not even as your ex-husband, just as someone who finally understands what he destroyed. His words didn't sting this time. They felt freeing. Ethan, I said softly, I forgave you a long time ago. Not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying anger is too heavy for someone trying to fly. He smiled, tears glistening in his eyes. You really did become someone incredible. I always was, I said with a gentle smirk. You just never looked close enough. He chuckled quietly, nodded, and left. As the elevator doors closed behind him, I felt the last piece of my past dissolve. That night, I hosted a gala celebrating the 5-year anniversary of Luna Rise. Cameras flashed, music filled the air, and I stood on stage in a shimmering silver gown, the embodiment of every dream Ethan once told me to abandon. When I stepped up to the microphone, I looked out at the crowd of entrepreneurs, designers, and young women who had come to celebrate. I smiled and said, 5 years ago, someone told me I wasn't built for success. Tonight, I stand here not to prove them wrong, but to prove that belief, not validation, builds empires. The applause thundered through the room. As the night drew to a close, I walked out onto the balcony overlooking the city. The skyline glowed beneath the stars, a reminder of every night I'd stayed awake chasing a dream no one believed in but me. Somewhere out there, Ethan was probably starting over, perhaps even in peace. But it didn't matter anymore. Because I had already won, not through revenge but through resilience. I built my empire not to destroy him, but to rediscover myself. And in doing so, I became everything he said I could never be: unstoppable, unshakable, unforgettable. And as the city lights reflected in my glass, I whispered the words that had carried me through every hardship. Never let their doubt define your destiny.